It was a moment frozen in time. The hospital corridors echoed with hurried footsteps and muffled sobs. Doctors and nurses whispered in disbelief as the news spread like wildfire. President John F. Kennedy had been shot. At Parkland Hospital, Jackie Kennedy stood in a blood-stained pink suit, her face blank with shock. The world watched, holding its breath, hoping for a miracle. But then, the final, chilling announcement came. John F. Kennedy was dead. America reeled. A nation built on hope was now drowning in sorrow. How could this happen? Who could do such a thing? The questions only deepened the grief. And yet, after all these years, the mystery still lingers. But what if we told you the case is finally solved and the answer isn't good? In the wake of President John F. Kennedy's assassination, the world demanded answers. The official response came less than a year later with the release of the Warren Commission report, an investigation that was supposed to lay the tragedy to rest. Its conclusion: Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. The report painted Oswald as a troubled loner with communist sympathies, a former Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union before returning to the US. He had found work at the Texas School Book Depository, a prime vantage point overlooking Dealey Plaza. From the 6th floor of that building, the commission claimed, Oswald fired 3 shots as Kennedy's motorcade passed below. One bullet missed, another struck both the president and Texas Governor John Connally, and the third delivered the fatal headshot. A clean-cut narrative tied up in a single villain. But from the moment the findings were released, doubts crept in. The so-called magic bullet theory, a critical piece of the official explanation, strained credibility. The commission insisted that a single bullet entered Kennedy's back, exited through his throat, then struck Connally's back, shattered his rib, exited his chest, hit his wrist, and lodged in his thigh, all while emerging in near-pristine condition. Skeptics were quick to argue that the bullet's path defied logic. Could one projectile do so much damage and still look almost untouched? Then came an even bigger shock. Just 2 days after Oswald's arrest, he was dead. In the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters, as officers prepared to transfer him to a higher secondary jail, Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner with ties to organized crime, stepped out of the crowd and shot Oswald at point-blank range. The gunfire rang out on live television, leaving millions of Americans stunned. Before Oswald could stand trial, before he could provide any real answers, he was silenced. The Warren Commission quickly dismissed the possibility of a conspiracy, reaffirming that Oswald acted alone and that Ruby's actions were spontaneous, driven by grief and rage over Kennedy's death. But many refused to believe it. If Oswald truly was the assassin, why was he never allowed to tell his side of the story? And why would a man like Jack Ruby, a figure deeply entangled in the criminal underworld, risk everything to eliminate him in broad daylight? As time passed, public skepticism only grew. The cracks in the official narrative widened and new questions emerged. If Oswald was not the lone gunman, then who was behind Kennedy's murder? But what if this story was crafted to hide something bigger? As the dust settled on November 22, 1963, a troubling reality emerged. The official story didn't match what many people saw and heard. The Warren Commission insisted that Oswald fired 3 shots from behind, but eyewitness accounts and forensic evidence painted a far more complicated picture. Eyewitnesses in Dealey Plaza described a scene of chaos. Dozens of people swore they heard gunfire from multiple directions, not just from the Texas School Book Depository. Some claimed they saw a flash of light and movement near the now infamous grassy knoll, a small elevated area to Kennedy's right. These weren't just random voices in the crowd. They included war veterans, experienced with gunfire, who were adamant that shots came from the front. If Oswald was the lone shooter positioned behind Kennedy, then how could this be? Then there was the medical evidence. The Parkland Hospital doctors who treated Kennedy described a large, gaping wound at the back of his head, suggesting a shot from the front, directly contradicting the Warren Commission's findings. Dr. Charles Crenshaw, one of the attending physicians, later insisted that Kennedy's wounds were consistent with an entry wound from the front, not an exit wound from behind. If true, this meant Oswald couldn't have been the only shooter. Yet within hours of the assassination, the government confiscated all medical records, film and x-rays, tightly controlling the official narrative. Perhaps the most controversial piece of evidence is the Zapruder film, the only known footage capturing the assassination in real time. Frame 313, in particular, shows Kennedy's head snapping backward violently upon impact. If Oswald had fired from behind, the force should have propelled Kennedy forward, not back. This disturbing contradiction fueled the grassy knoll theory, with many believing that a second shooter, possibly a professional marksman, delivered the fatal headshot from the front. Despite these glaring inconsistencies, government agencies worked swiftly to dismiss alternative explanations. Witnesses who contradicted the official story were ignored or pressured to change their accounts. Others mysteriously died under questionable circumstances in the years that followed. The Warren Commission, rather than addressing these issues head-on, pushed forward with its lone gunman narrative, shutting down dissenting voices. The cracks in the official story were impossible to ignore. The evidence suggested something far bigger than a single shooter acting alone. If Oswald wasn't the only one pulling the trigger that day, then who else was involved? These inconsistencies fueled decades of alternative theories. By the time John F. Kennedy entered the White House, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, was already one of the most powerful institutions in the United States. Formed in the aftermath of World War II, its official role was to protect the nation from foreign threats, but behind closed doors, it had become something much darker, a shadow force, with influence stretching across the world. And Kennedy, he wanted to dismantle it. Tensions between JFK and the CIA exploded after the Bay of Pigs disaster in 1961. The agency had orchestrated an invasion of Cuba using anti-Castro exiles, but the plan fell apart disastrously when Cuban forces crushed the attack. Kennedy, furious at the CIA's incompetence, refused to send American military support, leading to the operation's failure. The agency never forgave him. In the months that followed, Kennedy fired CIA Director Allen Dulles, the man who had overseen the failed invasion. He also spoke publicly about his mistrust of intelligence agencies, once saying he would splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. But did that statement seal his fate? Several reports suggest CIA operatives were present in Dallas on the day of Kennedy's assassination. Richard Helms, a high-ranking CIA official at the time, later admitted that the agency had monitored Oswald for years, yet somehow the FBI was never warned about any potential threat he posed. Even more chilling, declassified documents reveal the CIA had connections to anti-Castro groups, many of whom viewed Kennedy as a traitor for not fully supporting their fight against Fidel Castro. If the CIA wanted Kennedy gone, they certainly had the resources and operatives to make it happen. Then there's the issue of missing intelligence files. The Warren Commission relied heavily on documents provided by the CIA, but years later, it was discovered that many key records had been destroyed or classified indefinitely. Why? Among these lost files were Oswald's CIA records, which could have clarified whether he was merely a drifter or something more, a pawn in a larger game. Even JFK's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, suspected the CIA's involvement. He later confided to a close friend that he believed Kennedy's murder had been a retaliation for his efforts to weaken the agency. Some theorists suggest that Johnson, who had close ties to military and intelligence circles, may have turned a blind eye to a plot already in motion. The CIA's influence over government narratives cannot be ignored. The agency controlled much of the media coverage surrounding Kennedy's death, ensuring that conspiracy theories were dismissed as mere speculation. But with so much evidence missing, so many figures with hidden motives, and so many eyewitness accounts contradicting the official story, one question remains. Was the CIA more than just a passive observer in Kennedy's assassination? But the CIA wasn't the only group with a reason to want Kennedy gone. The Kennedy family was no stranger to backroom deals and secret alliances. To many, John F. Kennedy was the face of change, a charismatic leader who promised a brighter future. But behind closed doors, the Kennedys had long-standing ties to the criminal underworld, ties that may have led to JFK's downfall. During the 1960 presidential election, rumors swirled that the mafia played a crucial role in Kennedy's victory. Powerful crime bosses allegedly helped deliver votes in key states like Illinois and West Virginia, using their influence over corrupt union leaders and local politicians. It's believed that Sam Giancana, the ruthless Chicago mob boss, worked behind the scenes to secure votes for Kennedy, expecting that, in return, the new president would protect the mafia's interests. But that's not what happened. Once in office, JFK and his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, turned on the very people who had helped them win. Robert launched an aggressive campaign against organized crime, targeting mafia operations in gambling, drugs, and racketeering. Hundreds of mobsters were indicted, and their illegal empires threatened like never before. To the mafia, this wasn't just betrayal, it was war. One name stands out in this dark chapter: Carlos Marcello, the feared mafia boss of New Orleans. Marcello controlled a vast criminal empire stretching across the southern United States, and he despised the Kennedys. FBI wiretaps later revealed that Marcello allegedly plotted to get rid of the president, even stating that if JFK were dead, his brother Robert would lose power too. Some believe he even boasted about his role in the assassination years later, calling it the perfect hit. Then there's Jack Ruby, the man who silenced Lee Harvey Oswald before he could stand trial. Ruby was deeply connected to the mafia, running illegal gambling operations and working as an informant for mobsters. His sudden, almost theatrical killing of Oswald left many wondering, was he acting out of grief, or was he eliminating a loose end? Ruby himself hinted at a larger conspiracy, once saying, "If you knew the truth, you'd never believe it." But before he could reveal anything more, he mysteriously fell ill and died in prison. The mafia had the motive, the means, and the connections to pull off a hit of this magnitude. Some believe they worked alongside rogue elements within the CIA, taking advantage of the agency's disdain for Kennedy. Others argue that the mafia acted alone, orchestrating the hit with hired gunmen stationed throughout Dealey Plaza. But one thing is clear: JFK's assassination wasn't just a simple murder. It was a well-planned operation, and those who knew too much either died mysteriously or remained silent out of fear. But there's another theory even darker than these. In his farewell address in 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered a chilling warning. He spoke of the growing power of the military-industrial complex, a term he used to describe the dangerous alliance between the US military, defense contractors, and political leaders. He cautioned that if left unchecked, this powerful network could dictate national policy, prioritize war over peace, and operate beyond the reach of democracy itself. Just 2 years later, John F. Kennedy was dead, and many believe he was its most high-profile victim. At the heart of this theory lies one key question: did Kennedy's stance on war make him a target? By 1963, the US was deeply entangled in Vietnam, a conflict that was becoming increasingly unpopular. Kennedy, unlike his military advisors, was reluctant to commit to full-scale war. He believed the conflict was unwinnable and that the US should withdraw its troops before getting dragged into a costly quagmire. He had already signed National Security Action Memorandum 263, a document outlining his plan to pull out 1,000 troops from Vietnam by the end of 1963 and withdraw entirely by 1965. This decision put him at odds with the Pentagon, intelligence agencies, and the defense industry, all of whom had a vested interest in war. The Vietnam conflict was not just about ideology, it was a multi-billion-dollar business. Defense contractors, weapons manufacturers, and powerful military figures stood to make enormous profits from prolonged US involvement. Kennedy's withdrawal plan threatened that, and those who benefited from the war weren't going to let it happen without a fight. Many believe that his refusal to escalate the Vietnam War made him an enemy of the military-industrial complex, a network that had already proven its ability to topple foreign governments and manipulate global events. If they could orchestrate coups abroad, could they have done the same at home? There are unsettling links between the military and the events in Dallas. In the months before the assassination, Kennedy's relationship with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, his highest-ranking military advisors, had soured. General Curtis LeMay, a staunch war hawk, despised Kennedy's approach to diplomacy, especially his handling of Cuba and the Soviet Union. Some have speculated that members of the military elite may have collaborated with rogue CIA elements to ensure that Kennedy was removed before he could pull US forces out of Vietnam permanently. Even Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's successor, had deep ties to the military-industrial complex. After taking office, he immediately reversed JFK's withdrawal plans, escalating the war instead. Under his administration, defense spending skyrocketed, war profiteering surged, and US involvement in Vietnam deepened, just as the military and defense contractors had wanted all along. If Kennedy had lived, would America's history have been different? Was his assassination a message to future presidents not to challenge the interests of the military-industrial complex? Decades later, this theory remains one of the most compelling explanations for why a president so committed to peace met such a violent end. And then there's the possibility that Oswald wasn't involved at all. From the moment Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, something felt off. The alleged assassin of the President of the United States had no opportunity to defend himself, no moment to explain his actions. He barely had time to speak at all. But in the few words he did manage to say, one statement stood out. "I'm just a patsy." A patsy, a scapegoat, a man being set up to take the fall for someone else's crime. But if Oswald didn't act alone, or at all, then who pulled the strings? One of the most disturbing aspects of Oswald's story is his connection to intelligence agencies. Despite being portrayed as a troubled loner, Oswald had an unusual background. He was a former Marine who had been trained in radar operations, even stationed at a US base in Japan that monitored top-secret U-2 spy plane missions. Then, in 1959, he defected to the Soviet Union, claiming allegiance to communism. Most defectors were monitored as national security threats, but oddly enough, Oswald returned to the US in 1962 without facing charges or investigation. Instead, he settled back into American life as if nothing had happened. This raised a critical question: was Oswald working with the CIA or another intelligence agency? Some researchers believe he was part of a covert operation, a low-level asset used for surveillance or infiltration. His movements before the assassination suggest something deeper at play. Just weeks before Kennedy's murder, Oswald made a strange trip to Mexico City, where he visited both the Soviet and Cuban embassies. According to official reports, he tried to secure a visa to Cuba, allegedly so he could travel to the Soviet Union. But later investigations found contradictions in the records, with some witnesses even suggesting that the man claiming to be Oswald in Mexico City was an imposter. If true, was someone trying to frame him before the assassination even took place. When Oswald was arrested, the case against him moved at an alarming speed. He was questioned for hours without legal representation. The Dallas police were eager to declare him the lone assassin, despite no trial, no clear evidence linking him directly to the rifle, and a murder weapon that seemed conveniently discovered. And then, before he could testify, Jack Ruby executed him in broad daylight on live television. Ruby's connections to organized crime fueled suspicions that Oswald was silenced before he could reveal the truth. If Oswald had been part of a larger operation, was he meant to die that day too? Was he set up as the perfect fall guy, his life engineered to lead to this moment? The rushed handling of his case, the inconsistencies in the evidence, and the disturbing connections to intelligence circles all suggest that Oswald may never have been in control of his fate. He was arrested as a villain, but history may remember him as something else entirely, a man caught in a web far beyond his understanding. So, after all this, has the truth finally come out? For decades, the assassination of John F. Kennedy remained one of the most fiercely debated mysteries in American history. The official story, Oswald as the lone gunman, was challenged by witnesses, forensic evidence, and investigative journalists. But now, after nearly 60 years, new evidence has emerged that shatters the official narrative and confirms what many suspected all along: JFK's murder was more than just the act of a single gunman. One of the most damning revelations comes from newly declassified government files. In 2017 and 2021, thousands of documents related to the assassination were released, despite years of government resistance. These files expose shocking details, including records showing that the CIA had ongoing surveillance on Oswald, tracking him long before the assassination. Why would they monitor a so-called nobody? Even more disturbing, some documents suggest that intelligence agencies withheld information from the Warren Commission, ensuring that a deeper investigation was never conducted. Then, there's the forensic evidence that rewrites the crime scene. Advances in ballistics and wound analysis have provided new insight into the bullets that struck Kennedy. Several modern studies, including those by forensic pathologists and independent researchers, have concluded that the magic bullet theory is physically impossible, meaning the idea that a single bullet caused multiple wounds in both Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally simply doesn't hold up under scrutiny. If there was more than one bullet, there had to be more than one shooter. But perhaps the most shocking discoveries come from testimonies given by former government insiders, those who had long remained silent, either out of fear or allegiance to their agencies. One of the most explosive admissions came from E. Howard Hunt, a former CIA officer involved in numerous covert operations. Before his death, Hunt allegedly confessed to knowledge of a CIA-length plot to kill Kennedy, implicating high-ranking officials to eliminate the president. He referred to it as a big event orchestrated at the highest levels. Even more chilling are the revelations surrounding Carlos Marcello, the mafia boss suspected of orchestrating the hit. FBI documents reveal that Marcello allegedly confessed in prison to having played a role in the assassination. He reportedly boasted that he had JFK killed to get Bobby Kennedy off his back. His words align with decades-old suspicions that the mafia, the CIA, and rogue government elements worked together to remove a president who had become a liability to them all. So, what does this all mean? If the truth has been uncovered, why is it not good for the future? The answer lies in what the assassination represents, a moment when the most powerful forces in the world decided that a democratically elected leader could be eliminated if he threatened their interests. If the President of the United States could be taken out, without consequence, what does that say about the true nature of power? What does it mean for the future of democracy? Even with all this evidence, no one has ever been held accountable for Kennedy's murder. The truth may be known, but justice has remained out of reach. And yet, despite all the evidence, will we ever see true justice? More than 60 years have passed, yet John F. Kennedy's assassination still casts a long shadow over history. It was more than the loss of a leader, it was the moment America changed forever. Trust in the government fractured, the belief in transparency crumbled, and the questions never stopped. Despite mountains of evidence, no official body has ever acknowledged a conspiracy. Documents remain classified, key witnesses are long gone, and those who once sought the truth have been met with silence. If the crime of the century has been solved, why does the government still refuse to release every file? What are they hiding? This isn't just about history, it's about power, secrecy, and the struggle for truth. The assassination of JFK serves as a stark reminder that even the highest office in the land is not untouchable. If a president could be removed so easily, what does that say about democracy? But the fight for truth isn't over. The public still demands answers, pushes for justice, still refuses to accept a manufactured version of history. If the truth has been solved, why is it still being hidden?